The world was recently in shock with the attack on Salman Rushdie while he was giving an address in New York. His book, The Satanic Verses, was published in 1988. The fatwa declared by the Iranian regime, that was in 1989. He's been out of hiding for a long time. So this is quite unexpected, I'd say, that he should be attacked and nearly killed on stage at this point in time, and of all places in New York City in America.
Yeah, we have it on a very high authority that this attack has nothing to do with Islam. In fact, it's a crime that Islam does not accept, says the Secretary General of the Muslim World League. So what's it about? Let's find out.
I'm Brendon Fallon.
And I'm Lee Smith. And we're Over the Target.
So there is a long history to what's happened here. This goes back decades. Lee, you were involved in publishing at the time that this book was published and the fatwa was declared by the Iranian regime. What did you see going on at this time? What do you remember about that?
Yeah, that's right. I remember it very well. I was a young apprentice working in a New York publishing house, and my colleagues, many of my colleagues, worked in the publishing house that had published Salman Rushdie's novel, The Satanic Verses. And I remember very well that there were bomb threats over there all the time at those offices, and people had to be evacuated out of the offices. So it really had a lot of people understandably unsettled. The idea that a world power had issued this edict against a novelist, someone who's expressing their opinion, someone who was articulating their creative vision, and for that, an entire industry. The writer was under threat.
No doubt this was an incredibly traumatic experience for Rushdie. I heard that at one stage he believed his own family, his wife and his son were kidnapped or assassinated. This would have been a huge scare for him, obviously. Was anyone actually killed in the process when all this was happening at the time?
Yes, absolutely. The Japanese translator of the Satanic Verses was killed. There was also an attack on the Italian translator of the book. He was beaten and stabbed. So there was real violence going on. It wasn't just people that were calling in bomb threats to New York publishing offices. People were acting on this violence. And so what we've seen now is 4 decades worth of violence under the orders of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
At the time, there was clearly a lot of terrorist activity in response to the publishing of this book. I know that in the 1990s, a reformist leader in Iran basically said the fatwa on Salman Rushdie no longer applied, that the Iranian regime was no longer seeking the death of Salman Rushdie. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, Western powers frequently try to make this distinction between hardliners and moderates in order to be able to deal with murderous regimes, right? We've seen this with the Chinese Communist Party. We've seen people described as moderates who are responsible for the persecution, the torture, sexual abuse, and execution of many Chinese. Right. The same is true in Iran. They've tried to make this distinction between reformers or moderates and hardliners. It's very ugly, but this comes from the Western powers. So no, the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, this edict demanding his death to pay for his crime in writing a novel, no, this has never gone away. This has been hanging over his head and over the head of the West for decades, and unfortunately, Western leaders have covered up for the evil coming out of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
The idea of Iranian moderates, not just in Iran, but also with regimes like the Chinese Communist Party, are used by the West to excuse negotiating with these regimes. It brings to mind the Iran nuclear deal. I know that this was basically the crowning achievement of the Obama administration, and the idea was that this was going to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. But is that really the case? I mean, what's your take on this?
Brendon, that's a very good point, because that is part of the background of what's happening here, and this has been part of the coverage, and why you see that the press aligned with the Democratic Party, aligned with the Joe Biden administration, why they're doing their best to obscure the fatwa that has existed since the late 1980s, because that's exactly right. What they want to do is they want to re-enter, the Biden administration wants to re-enter the nuclear deal with Iran, all right? And what the purpose of this is, it's not, as the press has been reporting, since Barack Obama first negotiated the nuclear deal, it is not to prevent Iran from getting the bomb. It is to legalize Iran's nuclear weapons program. And the way you can tell that is quite simple. There are what we call sunset clauses that are written into the agreement. What the sunset clauses mean is that various things restricting Iran's activities will evaporate. They will fade. And at that point, once these sunset clauses have gone away, Iran will have a 100% legalized nuclear weapons program that the West, led by the Obama administration first, and now the Biden administration, will have pushed into history. So this is the background, and this is why people want to hide the fact that this fatwa, this attempt on Salman Rushdie's life, started with Iran in the late 1980s.
If that's the case, I imagine what's happened would be almost an inconvenience for the Iranian regime, and if they want this deal to go ahead.
It is an inconvenience, but not for the Iranians. It's an inconvenience for the Biden administration and the people who want to legalize Iran's nuclear weapons program. This shows them up. It shows up the fact that they're actually making a deal, not with moderates, but with hardliners, with murderers, right? Because we're looking not just at the attempt on Salman Rushdie's life, but there are others that the Iranians are plotting against on American soil, including Iranian dissident journalist Masih Ali-Nejad, including former Trump administration officials like former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, one of his deputies at the State Department, Brian Hook, as well as National Security Advisor John Bolton. Now, you may have seen in the press recently that the Department of Justice unsealed an indictment against an Iranian national who plotted on Bolton's life. The Iranians are very upfront about this, about targeting Americans on American soil. It's the Biden administration for whom this is inconvenient. The Iranians want to continue to prove that they are hard men, and that if they don't get the deal, and if they don't get what they want, and even if they do get what they want, they will continue to come after Americans on American soil.
And if anyone was deceived into thinking that there has been a significant change in the culture of the Iranian regime over the decades, I think this quote from Iran's foreign ministry settles that to some extent. In relation to the attack on Salman Rushdie, they said, "We in the incident of this attack do not consider that anyone deserves blame and accusations except him, Salman Rushdie, and his supporters." And I think the recent background of this man who attacked Salman Rushdie also supports the idea that there has been no real cultural change with the Iranian regime. If you're enjoying watching this episode of Over the Target on YouTube, you can catch Lee and I for the full episode on Epoch TV.
Watch us exclusively on Epoch TV, where you'll find not only Over the Target, but all your favorite Epoch TV shows, like The Wide Angle with Brendon Fallon.